Here we go. Rose and Victor are joining us on Zoom, and we have mercifully spared them the first few minutes where we were just talking about weird things that happened last Thursday. And so let us see. We were last Thursday, as a recap, just going around telling people what we read in our particular Franklin essay. And let's see. Did we get, how far did we get? Wow, that's a question that came out of the blue. Yes.
Maddie and I went, I think we had number 7, and we talked, but I think that was it.
Excuse me?
Maddie and I, we had number 7, and I think we talked about like what we read, but I think that really it.
Okay. So you read number 7 of Silence Do Good, which was on funeral elegies. And let me start with those. We could conceivably spend the rest of our lives talking about these. And you might think, boy, math class doesn't sound so bad now. Okay. Anyone else want to talk about theirs before we jump back to New England funeral elegies? I should tell you, I just spent, it was only an hour, but it seemed like a lifetime in a faculty. My mind is still a little numb. Someone said that her purpose is to infuse intentionality to whatever it was she was doing, or whatever it is that we're doing. And I the last hour to try to figure out what that means. So, okay. Let us, rather than this one, which I love, this is actually one of my favorite all-time pieces of writing. Bella and Maddie, find that scary book? Where do you find that? Yes, I can see the point. So it has been the complaint of many ingenious foreigners who have traveled amongst us that good poetry is not to be expected in New England. I am apt to fancy the reason is not because our countrymen are altogether void of a poetical genius, nor yet because we have not yet those advantages of education which other countries have, but purely because we do not afford the praise and encouragement which is merited when anything extraordinary of this kind is produced among us. What's this mean? Why isn't there good poetry in New England? Yes.
Because there's no encouragement.
Yeah, we don't encourage it enough. Yeah, it's not because we don't have the poetical genius or education. It's because we don't praise it enough. So, upon which consideration, I have determined when I meet with a good piece of New England poetry to give it a suitable encomium. Do you know what an encomium is? Can we figure it out from context? Or do you need to look it up? I will confess I've never looked this word up. I just kind of heard it from the context. Those of you who study Greek, I think probably figure it out. That's almost like confusing intentionality. That word praise. It's praise, okay? Okay. Suitable encomium, thereby endeavor to discover to the world some of its beauties, in order to encourage the author to go on to bless the world with more and more excellent productions. There has lately appeared among us a most excellent piece of poetry entitled An Elegy upon the Much Lamented Death of Mrs. Mehitabel Cattell, wife of Mr. John Cattell of Salem, etc. It may justly be said in its praise, without flattery to the author, that it is the most extraordinary piece that was ever wrote in New England. The language is so soft and easy, the expression so moving and pathetic, but above all, the verse and number so charming and natural, that it is almost beyond comparison. I find no English author, ancient or modern, whose elegies may be compared with this, in respect to the elegance of style, or smoothness of rhyme, and for the affecting part, I will leave your readers to judge, if they ever read any lines that would sooner make them draw their breath and sigh, if not shed tears, than the following. Come, let us mourn, for we have lost a wife, a daughter, and a sister, who has lately taken flight, and greatly we have missed her. Has anyone ever read anything like that? Okay. In another place, some little time before she yielded up her breath, she said, I ne'er shall hear one sermon more unheard. She kissed her husband some little time before she expired, then leaned her head to pillow on, just out of breath and tired. Is this praising the elegy to Mrs. Medivale Patel, deceased? Good home?
That's a good poem.
Why do you say so?
Well, just like the way it's like worded and like the words it uses and all, it like goes in a good rhythm.
Okay. Yes.
I think because this is satire and, you know, the way that it's kind of being framed, Franklin is saying this is not, you know, it's not very inspired. It's just sort of words written to convey a meaning, but it doesn't seem to have, it seems kind of like cookie cutter formulaic, I guess. And so he's pointing out that it's not, you know, the most breathtaking, inspiring thing you'll ever read.
I see Hannah's point does go along. It also is, as you say, formulaic. It's someone's dying words are, I will never hear another sermon. That I'm wondering if I made my dying words, maybe I'll never give another lecture, but I can't imagine anything, I'll never hear another lecture. And then out of breath and tired, she expired. Okay. And this must not pass unobserved. That line in the celebrated Watts, Isaac Watts was a writer of hymns about Dunstan the just, the generous, and the young, is nothing comparable to it. The latter, that is Watts, only mentions 3 qualifications of one person who was deceased, which therefore could raise grief and compassion but for one, whereas the former, our most excellent poet, gives his reader a sort of the idea of the death of 3 persons, that is, a wife, a daughter, and a sister, which is 3 times as much as the loss of death of one, and consequently must raise 3 times as much grief and compassion in the reader. And so, now it is a pity that such an excellent piece should not be dignified with a particular name, and singing cannot justly be called either epic, sapphic, lyric, or pindaric, nor any other name yet invented. I presume it may, in honor and remembrance of the dead, be called the Catholic. Thus much in praise of Catholic poetry. Okay, so Annalise put on that this was satire. The rest of us were reading this, I think, more seriously. And any other thoughts on this? What do you make of someone who's not only making fun of the way people write poetry in good faith in 1721, but is also making fun of Mrs. Medivale Patel? Anyone here descended from the Patel family? Here you have this smart-ass teenager mocking this poem that someone wrote in her tribute. Isn't that a little offensive? Yeah. I can see, you know, you're too good to have your phones out and be tweeting this about you can't believe this guy, and Franklin will be canceled by the end of the day for mocking Mrs. Medivale Patel, deceased. And all she did, she seemed to have a good life, right? And, you know, wife, a daughter, and a sister, and her, doesn't mention that she's a mother, so maybe she didn't leave any descendants who then could be taking up this cause. What else is he mocking? So mocking poor Mrs. Mehitabel Patel, who to our knowledge never did anything to him. And also this tradition among the Puritans of writing these kinds of funeral elegies.
Maybe he's just like mocking the fact that it's not remarkable. You know, like maybe it's not specifically, you know, she has a bad elegy, but like people that die should have something sort of memorable said about them and not just the same type of poetry that doesn't mean anything, because that doesn't do them justice. It's just like a regular thing.
Nothing for a follow-up. I think you went beyond my ability to comprehend. So I think that's good. Yeah. Can you say it again?
Yeah,
Using smaller words so I
yeah.
can understand it.
I was just trying to say that maybe part of it for him is like anybody that dies deserves more of a specific heartfelt elegy to them, you know, than one that's meant to be this big formulaic piece of writing that doesn't really have anything specific to do with them. You
Right.
know?
Yeah, because then he has this recipe at the end, how you would make one of these things, the stock phrases you would use, right? Dreadful, deadly, cruel, cold death, unhappy fate, weeping eyes. And these all, I think, are things we would experience if someone dies. But they become this formulaic, hackneyed thing, which doesn't have any real meaning. You know, Miss Mehitabel Patel, the wife, the daughter, and the sister, and we've missed her. You know, they're really straining for a rhyme. Sister, mister, and expired and tired. And you know, sermon, one more sermon yet on earth. This rhyme, earth rhymes with death. So the rhymes are a little coarse, but also, as Annalise said, it's somewhat formulaic and just ritual and loses its meaning. Okay, good. So those of you who are deeply offended at this, you're feeling, yes.
Couldn't it also be, there reasons to say that it's somehow almost like childlike, and it's like the attempt to be something that's not,
But it's,
the poem that Franklin's mocking, because it's trying to, at least from what I see, it's trying to be more than it actually is, because it is so formulaic, but it's come from the heart.
yeah, okay. So you're giving it more credit.
Yeah.
Okay. Anyone else? Yes.
I have a question. Why is this your favorite piece?
Why is it? It's not my favorite. It's one of my favorites, okay? And why is it? That's a very good question, and I'm not sure I know. I think and as I'm rethinking now of hearing this, and your use of the phrase childlike makes me also think this is written by someone who's what, 16 or so, 15 or 16. So this is the satire itself. I think it is because, and this guy is taking on the most essentially sacred things in this culture. And that is part of it. And also, and I believe there is a tradition of this, and I'm not sure if this is the beginning or not. Is anyone familiar with the poetic works of Emmeline Granger? Let me see if I can find this. I should have brought this in. If I'd known you wanted to talk about this, I certainly would have paid more attention to this. Let's see if I can find something else to share with you. In many ways, I see this as a prologue to it. There is, by the way, a long tradition of poetic elegance. That is things written, you know, because you're mourning something. And maybe it's because that's because I spent a lot of time for another class reading Emily Dickinson, who wrote about death a lot. But her poetry is actually really powerful. And this is, as you said, formulaic and sharp. Okay, let me see. Expand this properly. Okay. So this is a description from a 19th century novel. Okay. They have pictures hung on the walls, mainly Washington's and Lafayette's and Highland Mary's, and one called Signing the Declaration. There was some that they called crayons, which one of the daughters, which was dead, made her own self when she was only 15 years old. They was different from any pictures I ever seen before. Blacker mostly than is common. One was a woman in a slim black dress, belted under the armpits, with bulges like a cabbage in the middle of the sleeves, and a large black scoop shovel bonnet with a black veil, and white slim ankles crossed about with black tape, and very wee black slippers like a chisel. And she was leaning pensive on a tombstone, on her right elbow, under a weeping willow, and her other hand hanging down her side, holding a white handkerchief and a reticule. And underneath the picture, it said, "Shall I never see thee more, alas?" Another one was a young lady with her hair all combed up straight to the top of her head, knotted there in front of a comb, like a chair back, and she was crying into a handkerchief. And she had a dead bird laying on its back in her other hand with his heels up. And underneath the picture, it said, "I shall never hear thy sweet chirrup more, alas." There was one where a young lady was at a window looking up at the moon, tears running down her cheeks, and she had an open letter in one hand with black sealing wax showing on one edge of it, and she was mashing a locket with a chain of it to it against her mouth. And underneath the picture it said, "And art thou gone, yes thou art gone, alas." These was all nice pictures I read, but I didn't somehow seem to take to them, because if ever I was a little down, they always give me the fan times. Everybody was sorry she died, because she had laid out a lot more of these pictures to do, and the body could see by what she had done, what they had lost. But I reckon that with her disposition, she was having a better time than the graveyard. But what do you make of this girl's pictures? So you haven't read the rest of the book. You don't know anything about her family. Her family is constant. They're in a feud with another family, and they keep killing each other. So her life has been surrounded by these meaningless deaths, and she, as a 15-year-old, is doing all of these paintings, which all have as their theme someone being dead, the bird, you're gone, etc. And it's just, this is the overwhelming thing we get. This is tragic. Isn't this Emily Grangerford's life a tragedy so far? And then she dies. And he says, well, she's probably happier where she is, because this is kind of what she likes, this morbidity. Okay. These was all nice, okay. Everybody was sorry she died. She was at work on what they said was her greatest picture when she took sick. Every day and every night, it was her prayer to be allowed to live till she got it done. But she never got the chance. It was a picture of a young woman in a long white gown, standing on the rail of a bridge, all ready to jump off, with her hair all down her back, and looking up to the moon, with tears running down her face. And she had two arms folded across her breast, two arms stretched out in front, and two more reaching up toward the moon. And the idea was to see which pair would look best, and then scratch out all the other arms. But as I was saying, she died before she got her mind made up, and now they kept this picture over the head of the bed in her room. And every time her birthday come, they hung flowers on it. Other times it was hid with a little curtain. The young woman in the picture had kind of a nice, sweet face, but there were so many arms, it made her look too spidery to me. The young girl kept a scrapbook when she was alive and used to paste obituaries and accidents and cases of patient suffering in it out of the Presbyterian Observer and write poetry after them out of her own head. It was very good poetry. This is what she wrote about a boy by the name of Stephen Dowling Box that fell down a well and was drowned. Gordon, can you read the ode to Stephen Dowling Box deceased?
And did young Stephen sicken? And did young Stephen die? And did the sad hearts thicken? Did the mourners cry? No, such was not the fate of young Stephen Dowling. But though sad hearts round him thicken, 'twas not through sickness big complicated racket spraying or spots, not these imperative sacred name. Spies loves struck not with blood and head of knots, from stomach troubles later blow, thoughts. Oh no, then listen tearful eye, lost, I can spake you tell, soul big from this fly, I told you. I got him out and emptied it, alas, it was too late, the spirit was gone, sport aloft from the rise.
If Emmeline Grangerford could make poetry like that before she was 14, there ain't no telling what she could have done by and by. Huck said she could rattle off poetry like nothing. She didn't ever have to stop to think. He said she would slap down a line, and if she could find anything to rhyme with it, she would just scratch it out and slap down another one and go ahead. She weren't particular. She could write about anything you choose to give her to write about, just so it was sad. Every time a man died, or a woman died, or a child died, she would be on hand with her tribute before he was cold. She called them tributes. The neighbors said it was the doctor first, then Emmeline, then the undertaker. The undertaker never got in ahead of Emmeline but once, and then she hung fire on a rhyme for the dead person's name, which was whistling. She weren't ever the same after that. She never complained, but she kind of caned away and did not live long. Poor thing. Many's the time I made myself up to go up to that little room that used to be hers, get out that poor old scrapbook and read in it when her picture's been aggravating me and I soured on her a bit. So, I guess we have two people to talk about here. One is, of course, Emmeline Grangerford, and the other is the kind of malicious spirit that would mock this poor girl writing these tributes to her dead neighbors, women, men, women, and children, slapping down a line, not even having to think about it, and then finally expiring when she couldn't find a good rhyme for whistling. So which one should we start with? Poor Emmeline Grangerford, who never, I think, did any harm to anybody, such as happened to be born into this tragic world, or the cretin who would mock her in something like this. Yes. You want to start with the cretin who would mock her or something like this? Does anyone know who this cretin is? Okay. I think this particular cretin has a lot of similarities to the cretin we've been talking about, even though he didn't really like him now. He never met him, but knew a lot about him. We'll talk more about it later. What is it this guy's making fun of? I think it's the same thing Frank does. We're mocking or satirizing. I know we should be telling you these things rather than asking you for them. I mean, it's a culture of sentimentality and of mourning without really thinking. Not that we shouldn't mourn, but you know, he says she never had to think. She just slaps down a line. What do you think of this poem?
The one to
Stephen Dowling Butts.
It's definitely well written, especially for someone who's so young. She like has her like the way she writes, and you can tell in the poem, and like you can definitely see that in this one, even without seeing something else that she had written, that she does better when it is about this sad thing.
Okay.
Stated in like the paragraph afterwards, but just in the poem you can tell that she's got like this sort of like empathy to the people and has like the ability to like express that with her words.
Okay. Yes, that's super.
I would say that she doesn't really describe the person, she more just describes death through the person. And
Yeah.
like she describes their features and how they looked when they died. But she doesn't talk about the person.
No, she talks about how he died. Okay, that's a very good point. And does describe the things he didn't die from. You know, whooping cough, sickness, despised love, stomach troubles, and it's a progression of different things. And then how does he die?
She does well.
well.
He falls down a well, yeah, okay. His soul did from this cruel world fly by falling down a well. That's an interesting image, isn't it? And then they took him home and emptied him, unless it was too late. But yeah.
Kind of like what you had been saying, that she doesn't really talk about the person. It feels very impersonal, and it sort of makes sense later when hearing about, like you were saying, how she just sort of slaps down lines and hopes that they rhyme, and she does this for everybody. So it's not necessarily like, there's one particular person that she misses and crafts this beautiful poem for. It's more like, hey, somebody else died, so we have to write a poem about it. And I think that the criticism of this, as with Franklin, was just that there's not as much mindful thought going into these. It's more just like somebody died, so we write a poem, because that's just what we do.
That's I think, had you told me to say that half an hour ago, I think it would have been much further along in the class. Yes. Okay, I see that. Anyone else have any thoughts on this? Just one thing to keep in mind. Emily Grangerford was a fictional character. So the person who wrote this poem was actually the same creature that Chloe was condemning earlier. And so not the 14-year-old Emily Grangerford. I don't know if that colors the way you think about the poem. That it's not this 14-year-old, but it's someone mocking a death-obsessed 14-year-old, which I suppose makes it different, I think, better or worse. Okay. So he said, we know nothing about Stephen Dowling Potts other than what he didn't die from and then what he did. And that seems to be Emily Grangerford's fixation, which is, I think, what this particular author is getting at, which I think may be similar to what our friend Franklin was trying to get at with his rather juvenile side. It's interesting. Well, I should refrain from saying things that are interesting. But that Emily Grangerford, about the same age as Franklin is when he's writing the satire on the Isabel Cattell deceased. Okay. No one knows where this is from. Yes.
Isn't it from Huckleberry Finn?
It is from Huckleberry Finn. Yes, thank you. No one else wanted to acknowledge that they read Huckleberry Finn. Yes, it is. What do you think?
The book in general?
Yeah.
It was a good read.
Okay.
Definitely interesting, especially reading it in a current times. You can see how different the world was when it was written.
Okay. Okay. Good. So the one thing this has in common with Franklin again is it's a satire. It's a satire of this particular society. Okay. Good. I'm sorry for this digression into 19th century America. Let's get back to Franklin. And why don't we take a look next at number 6, which is the polyphate. Okay, I think not to have you guys monopolize the conversation. Did you read this last week? Okay, let me see if I can find it. Did anyone else read this since last week? And said, thank you for the list. I'm just curious who dove in and said, yes, I want to read everything that this guy tells us to read, because he's someone I can't find in the classroom from 1 week to the next. Why wouldn't he be our guide to speech of Miss Polly Baker? Okay. Someone want to read this? The rest of us. Otherwise, you have music, and it's not quite the same for analysis. Okay. So this was published in 1747 at Connecticut, near Boston, in New England, where she was prosecuted the 5th time for having a bastard child, which influenced the court to dispense with her punishment and induced one of her judges to marry her the next day. May it please the honorable bench to indulge me in a few words. I am a poor, unhappy boy who have no money and fee lawyers to plead with, being hard put to get a tolerable living. I shall not trouble your honors with long speeches, for I have not the presumption to expect that you may by any means be prevailed on to deviate in your sentence from the law in my favor. All I humbly hope is that your honors would charitably move the governor's goodness on my behalf, that my fine may be remitted. This is the 5th time, gentlemen, that I have been dragged before your court on the same account. Twice I have paid heavy fines, and twice have been brought to public punishment for want of money to pay those fines. This may have been agreeable to the laws, and I don't dispute it. But since laws are sometimes unreasonable in themselves, and therefore repealed, and others bear too hard on the subject of particular circumstance, and therefore there is left a power somewhere to dispense with the execution of them. I take the liberty to say that I think this law by which I am punished is both unreasonable in itself and particularly severe with regard to me, who have always lived an inoffensive life in the neighborhood where I was born, and defy my enemies, if I have any, to say I ever wronged man, woman, or child. What's the law that she finds unfair? Yes.
That you're not allowed to give birth without being married.
Yes, so she has 5 times given birth out of wedlock. Okay, and this is why she is now called before the court. Okay, abstracted from the law, I cannot conceive, may it please your honors, what the nature of my offense is. I have brought 5 fine children into the world at the risk of my life. I have maintained them well by my own industry, without burdening the township, and would have done it better if it had not been for the heavy charges and fines I have paid. Can it be a crime in the nature of things, I mean, to add to the number of the king's subjects in a new country that really wants people? I own it. I should think it a praiseworthy rather than a punishable action. I have debauched no other woman's husband, nor enticed any youth. These things I never was charged with, nor has anyone the least cause of complaint against me, unless perhaps the minister or justice, because I have had children without being married, by which they have missed a wedding fee. But can this ever be a fault of mine? I appeal to your honors. You are pleased to allow I don't want sense, but I must be stupefied to the last degree, not to prefer the honorable state of wedlock to the condition I live. I always was and still am willing to enter into it, and doubt not my behaving well in it, having all the industry, frugality, and skill in economy appertaining to a good wife's character. I defy any person to say I ever refused an offer of that sort. On the contrary, I readily consented to the only proposal of marriage that ever was made to me, which was when I was a virgin. But too easily confiding in the person's sincerity that made it, I unhappily lost my own honor by trusting to his, for he got me with child and then forsook me. That very person you all know. He's now become a magistrate of this country, and I had hopes he would have appeared this day on the bench and have endeavored to moderate the court in my favor. Then I should have scorned to mention it, but I must now complain of it as unjust and unequal, that my betrayer and undoer, the first cause of all my faults and miscarriages, if they must be deemed such, should be advanced to honor and power of the government that punishes my misfortunes with stripes and infamy. I should be told, 'tis like that there were no act of assembly in the case, the precepts of religion are violated. Well, let's back up here. So what's her story? Yes, Chloe.
She's kind of saying that she's doing just fine raising her own kids by herself, and that if anything, the fines and stuff for this are hurting her more,
Yes.
and that she's totally fine with getting married. She just hasn't found the right person yet, and that the first person that she actually did end up getting with left her once he got her pregnant, and then now he's some high up person in the government.
Yeah.
Making these rules to then punish her. for
Yeah,
what he did.
He's one of the judges, but he didn't show up on this particular day. Yeah, very apt summary of this. Okay, anything else we get out of this? Yes.
She's basically just pointing out the hypocrisy of everything that the system is telling her to do, which is that it's pretty much their fault as a representative from their system was the first one to get her into this. He's being rewarded and she's being punished. And the punishing is, making it even worse for her own situation, which isn't hurting them.
Okay, anything else? This is good. Okay. So that's the, so if mine is a religious offense, leave it to religious punishments. You have already excluded me from the comforts of your church community. Is not that sufficient? You believe I have offended heaven and must suffer eternal fire. Will not that be sufficient? What need is there then of your additional fines and whippings? I own, I do not think as you do. For if I thought what you call a sin was really such, I could not presumptuously commit it. But how can it be believed that heaven is angry at my having children, when to the little done by me towards it, God has been pleased to add his divine skill and admirable workmanship in the formation of their bodies, and crowned it by furnishing them with rational, immortal souls? Is it a sin for Polly Baker to bring children into the world, is she saying? It's not.
She's saying that it's not, but even if it was, then, that should be enough for the law to just let her be judged by the divine instead.
Yeah, that if this is a sin, then she'll take the punishment for that sin, or it should be left to God to punish. But then she's saying it isn't really a sin because look at these 5 children. And yeah, okay. So let's see. Forgive me, gentlemen, if I talk a little extravagantly on these matters. I am no divine as a minister. But if you, gentlemen, must be making laws, do not turn natural and useful actions into crimes by your prohibitions, but take into your wise consideration the great and growing number of bachelors in the country, many of whom, from the mean fear and the expenses of raising a family, have never sincerely and honorably courted a woman in their lives, and by their manner of living leave unproduced, which is little better than murder, hundreds of their posterity to the 1,000th generation. Is not this a greater offense against the public good than mine? What's this other offense? Who did his clue?
There's a bunch of men out there that aren't even offering women to,
Yeah.
take their hand in marriage and helping to raise these families.
Yeah. What about these bachelors, right? Who aren't getting married and they are leaving unborn children is one thing they're leaving. Yes. So let's see. And they're doing this because they don't want the expense of raising them. Compel them then by law either to marriage or to pay double the fine of fornication every year. What must poor young women do whom custom have forbid to solicit the men and who cannot force themselves upon husbands when the laws take no care to provide them any, and yet severely punish them if they do their duty without them? The duty of the first and great command of nature and of nature's God, increase and multiply. A duty from the steady performance of which nothing has been able to determine. But for its sake, I have hazarded the loss of public esteem and have frequently endured public disgrace and punishment, and therefore ought, in my humble opinion, instead of a whipping, have a statue erected to my memory. So, what's Miss Polly Baker telling the court in Connecticut? Yes.
She's basically saying that they should be enforcing these things for the men instead of the women, and they can't expect them to, have children, but then get mad if they don't have children with a husband, but then not help them get a husband by like setting up structure for the men. basically.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. Anything else? Any other? Yes.
I noticed how she mentioned towards the end, like, instead of removing type of statue,
Yeah,
right? But
yeah.
I mean, if you start saying like, undeserved credit for like,
Yeah, she's brought 5 children into the world, and that's both something we need to increase the population, but also she's saying that is the first commandment, that is to increase and multiply, which is what God told Adam and Eve, right? So she is obeying that commandment. And what about these bachelors who are not? So, does this convince the court, by the way? Yes.
Well, Franklin says it does.
Well, let's leave Franklin out of it for the moment. We'll just take this as
Yes.
something that appears in the newspaper. We know it's Franklin, but, and it says at the very beginning, the heading is.
At Connecticut, near Boston, New England, where she was prosecuted for the 5th time for having a bastard child, which influenced the court to dispense their punishment and induced one of the judges to marry her the next day.
Who's that judge? Yeah, the guy who originally impregnated, right? Okay, so she pulled him out. So he wasn't here today, right? So, yeah, okay. Wow, what do we make of this particular satire? This one? Yes.
I mean, it's really smart. It's like calling out religion and like guys who just like take it into their own hands and just what they want.
Yeah, it's calling out a lot of things here. I mean, this is really an extraordinary piece. Extraordinary, not in the sense that the Mahidabel Patel piece was, but this as a satire. Okay, now, as I said, we know it was Franklin, and there is actually a story that in the late 1770s, when Franklin is at the in France, he and Silas Deane are the 2 American commissioners there negotiating with the French. Silas Deane is from Connecticut, and Abbé Raynal was a French. Abbé Raynal wrote an encyclopedia. He wrote all kinds of things, an encyclopedia. And one of the things he was interested in was how come in the New World people have more children than they do in Europe, which is true. And how come the population in America is growing faster than the population in Europe? And this was a phenomenon a lot of people wrote about. And Abbé Raynal found out that Silas Deane, the other American commissioner, was from Connecticut. And he wanted to know from Deane if he knew what town Holly Baker was from. Because in his encyclopedia, where he is writing about the proclivity of American women, he cited this as an example. And Deane says that I thought that was fiction. I thought it was a satire. And Raynal says, no, it couldn't have been, because it's such a great story. I mean, it's so articulate and all. And this conversation goes on for quite a while before Franklin admits that he had actually written this. This is 30 years early. So this made such an impression on the Abbé Raynal that he included it in his encyclopedia, and then finds out 30 years later that it actually wasn't true. It's a made-up story, made up not for the purpose of showing how the population in America is growing, but something else. I think we've gotten at a lot of these other things. The injustice of the laws, the treating men and women differently, and et cetera, et cetera. Wow, okay. I'm happy continuing talking, but I think I really should give you more of an opportunity to get words in edgewise. So why don't we do this? Why don't we, because our next thing we will be doing is, you will be doing, I should say, is creating satires. And so what I would like is if we can form, say, groups of 3, 4, or 5, depending upon where you're sitting, and talk for the next few minutes about something you would think right for satire. Okay, so that's what you'll do now. Yes, sir.
Question.
Yes, sir.
So do you care how offensive it is? Or,
Offensive to whom?
to any particular person?
Are you talking, if it's about me, then yes, I do care. What do you mean by offensive?
Like political.
Okay, I would try, okay, the last time I did this in a class, and I was fortunate to find another job after that. No, it was, I suggest we stay away from politics. Okay, that's one thing, okay? You know, there's lots to be satirized in politics, but it turned to, you know, what we've really seen over the last 20 years is one of the reasons for the death of humor has been the fact that most humorists have simply said kind of banal things about whoever happens to be in office or whoever they don't like politically. So if you are going to satirize someone politically, make sure it's someone you agree with. Okay, that would be one rule. Second rule would suggest would be just stay away from politics and think about other things. I don't want to constrain you. Here we've talked about mocking death. I mean, what more can you do than mock death the way Franklin and Twain are doing? And it's probably the thing we all are going to face, and much more important in the long run than, you know, we're president of the Boston City Council that Andre here wants to satirize. So that would be my suggestion. Of course, you may get into a group and you find out the person you want to satirize is the one they have posters up for, and anyway. Okay. Any other questions? Okay, so why don't you form yourselves into little groups and talk about this. Wow, you're really jumping at this opportunity. And try to keep 6 feet apart. Well, we should talk, maybe before we do, we should talk about things that are right for satire. Aside from politics, which is a continual source of satirical material, or good things that people have to wit. The problem with it is, you know, Franklin might have written political satires, but who here would know what are the burning issues of 1747, or the burn of the political personalities of 1747 that should be satirized? And what's topical today is forgotten tomorrow. If you really are interested, you become a historian and bore people with it for the rest of your life. So anyway, so why don't we do that? You can move around if you'd like.
Yeah, okay.
You're good.
Okay, because I wasn't quite sure.
That's it, yeah. Definitely code description. It's pretty comfortable.
Okay. Like, if I do it at least not, yeah, I mean, it's so easier when I go home, I'm expecting like grand deals. Yeah. That would make, I feel like I can really, I have a lot of personal stuff, but I have a hard time, like, I always try to like, it's like, they're all opposites in there. Because like, I was thinking, everybody is real, some people that like, how do they be about like, yeah. So that one knows everything.
Yeah, I know that.
That's good.
I think that's like a good way, like, you're sort of like, you talk about the joke, like, it's like, like ideas of people, it's kind of like funny.
Let's say you get like not.
I like, I think of things and how like.
I feel like right now, like, it's
also
just
very.
You know what I'm saying?
I'm all that.